Previously, the great Herbert IV started his life as a humble count in the Kingdom of France. He wouldn't let his family's name fall into insignificance, so he marched on his neighboring rulers and seized their land. He brought himself great power and wealth, and eventually, he became the King of France. But his conquest isn't finished yet, for he seeks to restore the Carolingian borders. This is the story of the Last Karling. The first thing that Herbert did with his newly claimed kingdom was swear fealty to the Holy Roman Empire. He then changed his contract and demanded that he was made the steward of the empire, bringing his total monthly income to over 20 gold. Since the HRE has an election for its next emperor, Herbert could get voted in and become the new emperor. Knowing this, he got to work. He began swaying his fellow vassals that had the highest voting power in the election. As a backup, in case he didn't get voted as the new emperor, he began a scheme that would grant him a claim on the empire. In an unforeseen turn of events, the door burst open in front of Herbert, and he saw his courtier, Godo, fleeing from his brother Eudes. Eudes lunged at Godo, a glinting blade in his hand, but she was already on the move. She jumped from Eudes' path, and he looked upon the terror-filled Herbert, faltering as he realized Herbert wasn't his intended target, but he had too much momentum to stop the blade. It rushed towards Herbert's neck, who used all his strength to attempt to dodge the blade, but he knew that his chances were grim. He prayed with all his might, and he heard the voice of God saying, "Nuh-uh." The blade sank into his neck, and the life faded from his eyes as blood poured out of his lacerated skin. Stricken by the grief of his father's murder, Herbert's firstborn son rose to the throne. He will never be able to forget the doings of his uncle. For every time someone calls his name, he will be reminded. He was, after all, named after that very uncle. But now was no time to grieve. Eudes was now the King of France, and he knew he had to follow his father's legacy and restore the Carolingian Empire. He picked up right where his father left off, swaying the most powerful vassals in the HRE. He also worked to get one of his dynasty on the throne of England by starting a scheme to murder the current heir. Since his sister was matrilineally married to one of William's sons, the only thing Eudes had to do was ensure that William the Red would inherit the kingdom, and one day his nephew would become the King of England. After some time, Eudes settled into his role and was able to make some time away from ruling. He began a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. 9 months into his journey, he got word that his wife had given birth to a child. He sent word that this boy will be named Charlemagne, for if Eudes himself didn't restore the Carolingian Empire, this boy most certainly will. Even though he was hundreds of miles away, he began educating the boy. I don't know how, but he did it. He would ensure that this boy would become the perfect man to restore Charlemagne's empire. But Eudes hoped that he wouldn't have to worry about that, and he could finish what his father started before he reached his end. The pilgrimage succeeded, and Eudes now had over 2,500 piety. What he wanted all that piety for, only time will tell. Once Eudes returned from the pilgrimage, he learned that one of his vassals had a claim on the Duchy of Barcelona. This was very useful for Eudes, since he would need part of Iberia to restore the Carolingian borders. He declared war and marched his men into Aragon. He found the enemy army and began pursuit, leaving some of his men to siege one of the Barcelonian baronies. He caught the army, which stood no chance against his much larger and superior force. As the battle raged in the mighty Pyrenees, Eudes sensed that he was being watched. He heard the voice of Godo, who, if you don't remember, was the intended target of Herbert's murderer. Her voice had an ominous tone. The horned god offers you his blessing. Do you accept it? Obviously, Eudes didn't hesitate to accept. It's not like he was religious or anything. He definitely didn't have the most piety of anyone in the world. Not at all. Back in the Pyrenees, the battle was quickly finished, and now it was only a matter of time before Barcelona would be under Eudes' control. After many more sieges, there was no other option for Aragon but to accept Eudes' demands. Now Barcelona was part of France, and the conquest of Carolingian Iberia had started. Eudes' plan to get his nephew on the English throne had been ruined when William died prematurely, but all hope wasn't lost. The new king only had 2 children, and it just so happened that the daughter wasn't betrothed. So Eudes set up a marriage between his heir Charlemagne and this daughter. And after murdering the new king and his son, she was the Queen of England. Now there was no more for Eudes to do except wait for the natural course of life to play out. After many years of fighting for his English ally over and over again, Eudes went on another pilgrimage. Even though he was called to yet another war by Queen Alice of England, he continued to Jerusalem. He finished his pilgrimage and now had nearly 5,000 piety, and he was still making 10 piety per month. Even though he was the most pious man in the world, he definitely wasn't the most devout. He had been working in the shadows to convert the majority of his house members to witchcraft, and he now had everything he needed to start the Karling Coven. All of Eudes' swaying and scheming had finally brought him success. He now had a claim on the Holy Roman Empire and the favor of many of his fellow vassals. Since the emperor had recently died and his successor wasn't very established, Eudes had no struggle in finding support for his faction to install himself on the throne. With a military that was nearly 5 times the size of the Kaiser's, Eudes pressed his demands. The Kaiser saw that there was no hope and he said, "Okie dokie." Eudes was now the emperor of the HRE. With his new title, Eudes had power that he couldn't have even imagined. With this new power and his stockpiled piety, Eudes founded a new religion. He enacted the tenets of pursuit of power, communion, and mendicant preachers, and he established lay clergy and a temporal head of faith. Now he wouldn't just be Emperor Eudes, he would be Pope Eudes. And with all 77 of his vassals converting, Eudes created the Carlistic faith. In a little bit of a cheeky play, Eudes made the Empire of Francia his primary title and granted the kingdom of Aquitaine to his grandson. He then granted every kingdom under the Holy Roman Empire except for Bohemia to him. Now he could grant away the HRE to the king of Bohemia and not lose any land that he needed to restore the Carolingian borders. This had to be done because no one is allowed to restore the Carolingian borders unless someone else holds the title of the Holy Roman Empire. Unfortunately, Eudes should have waited until he had all the land he needed to restore the borders before doing this, since the newly independent HRE was incredibly unstable and the title was destroyed and he lost nearly all of his income because he now had barely any direct vassals. Before he could fix that problem, Eudes began to conquer the rest of Iberia that he needed. And while he was in the midst of these wars, his grandson and heir was murdered. This sent Eudes on a mad dash to pump out some more kids, so he could have a new genius son. He was so desperate that he tried to marry the Queen of England, who just so happened to be his granddaughter. Thankfully, when he created his new faith, he didn't allow for unrestricted marriage, so that was a no-go. But even though he couldn't marry her, he still tried to seduce her. But she was like, "No way, Jose." And that was that sorted. While Eudes was cleaning up the rest of the land that he needed in Iberia, the Pope declared a crusade on him. Uh-oh. Now was the time to show these Catholic pretenders what the real faith was. Hoorah! Even though the Pope had been crushed and smashed right into the ground, Eudes still felt the need to rub it in some more and declared war to take his land. It wasn't just out of spite though. Eudes actually needed to control northern Italy if he was to restore the Carolingian Empire. And once that land was gained, Eudes began to fix the mess that he had made when he granted away the Holy Roman Empire. And once that was fixed, the Kingdom of England was no longer allied to Francia, so Eudes could declare war for Normandy. But he didn't just declare war for Normandy, no. Why would he do that? He declared war for the entirety of England. And since it was an invasion conquest, he would gain control of all the land that he held at the end of the war. So that way he could take Normandy and England in the same war. But before England could be conquered, they killed me. Thankfully, the old Eudes was able to have a son before he died, and he was cutting it real close. But this new Charlemagne wasn't the genius he had hoped for. He'd have to do though. Charlemagne continued this war for England, but was constantly distracted by his vassals rising up against him. Like, come on guys. But the 1-year-old was able to hold his realm together and defeat the English. Young Charlemagne spent the next couple of years of his life cleaning up what little land he still needed, and he grabbed a little bit extra just because he could. And nearly 100 years after Herbert began the dream of restoring Charlemagne's empire, the 17-year-old and aptly named Charlemagne granted away the HRE and restored the Carolingian Empire.